Blake Leath. Welcome to the Gratitude Series. Next time, I want to thank the optimists among you, and in particular, Gary Moreau, Randy Pausch, and John Krasinski for the examples they set. But before we get to episode 3, today's episode begins with some bad news. Because I've got to acknowledge why nearly everywhere we look, there's a whole heck of a lot to be pessimistic about. In fact, pessimism across seemingly countless realms, all of them important. Though today we'll limit our focus to looking through 11 lenses. Individually, relationally, familially, organizationally, economically, educationally, culturally or societally, at social media, pandemically or post-pandemically, politically, through both new and traditional media, and eventually, spiritually. So let's start with the first of these 11 realms, individually or intrapersonally. The World Happiness Report, which, yes, is a thing, tells us a lot about what we already know. That stress, worry, and sadness are on the rise, and that depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide. According to the CDC, what they call deaths of despair, overdoses, suicide, and liver disease caused by alcoholism are now the first, second, and sixth leading cause of death for people ages 15 to 44 years old. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people ages 10 to 34 in the U.S., and is the 10th leading cause of death here, period. The overall suicide rate in the U.S. having increased by 35% since 1999. Relationally or interpersonally, I think a lot of the past 3 years' headlines have got to revolve around words like loss, change, exhaustion, uncertainty, ambiguity, disruption, and the like. Every year, new words, acronyms, and expressions crop up, or new interpretations, usages, or combinations of old terms are born. And should they become mainstream, these neologisms get officially added to the dictionaries. So as we reflect on 2020 through 2022 neologisms, interpersonally or relationally, it's no wonder a great many people describe feeling somewhat disoriented by so much change in such a short period of time. In our newish to now shared vocabulary, and including old words that have probably been spoken more in recent months than in all the decades preceding combined, well, we're way past factoid, meme, and gaslighting. Here are 100 fresh additions stateside to our linguistic canon in just the past 24 to 36 months. Adorkable, altcoin, anti-masker, blurs day, cancel culture, contactless, and yeah, not a new word, but definitely a new context. Coronavirus, Covexit, COVID-19, Covideo party, Covidiot, DNI, DEI, DIB, DEB, deplatformed, digital nomad, doom scrolling, election denier, fake news, Fauci ouchie, FOMO sapien, Galentine's Day, gift economy, goblin mode, hybrid, jab, lockdown, masking, mass shaming, metaverse, micro-wedding, NFT, quarantines, quarantine baby, quiet firing, quiet quitting, RTO, shake bumping, shrinkflation, side hustle, super spreader, Teams as a Microsoft app rather than what the word has meant since the mid-1500s. The Big Quit, the Great Resignation, the Miley Cyrus, the Rona, the Tridemic, Vax, virtue signaling, WFH, woke, workcation, Zoom bombing, and just plain old Zooming. And I've also heard more people speak of their introversion, extroversion, feelings, resilience or lack thereof, and of their own mental health than I ever had before. Yeah, it's been a wild relational ride these past few years. And as a result, for many of us, it can feel sort of like new social conventions whiplash or sleep inertia, that groggy, disorienting cognitive impairment we all feel when roused abruptly from a nap. Familially speaking, Many experienced a pandemic within a pandemic, as 34% of U.S. couples reported increased marital stress, with some of that stress escalating to physical altercations, as domestic violence incidents rose by more than 8% last year. And perhaps less dramatic, though equally pernicious, whenever I travel or dine alone, I continue to find myself surrounded by family after family, prioritizing their iPhones over their offspring at the dinner table. I vividly remember what would have otherwise been a great Italian dinner, but I was seated next to a family in which two boys, probably 5 and 7, their feet dangling, couldn't even touch the floor, continued to look across the table to their father, saying, "Dad, Dad, Dad," wanting to tell him something, show him something, ask him something. He didn't hear a word they said. They sat at that table for the better part of 2 hours, and after a while, no response from Dad, his being incredibly consumed by his iPhone, those two young boys stared silently into space. I'm not sure that's a great way to raise kids, and I'm positive they won't forget it. Organizationally, my goodness, where to begin? Since the dawn of humankind, work, or vocation, from the Latin vocare, to call or be called, has arguably been one of the most fundamental anchors of human identity, and is today, at the very beginning, was already become a staggering amount of cultural disruption, swifter and more radical than even our nation's transformation from a rural and agricultural economy to an urban and industrial one. At that time, one response to social disruption was alcoholism, which begat prohibition. Today, one reason the average American lifespan has declined for 3 consecutive years is that many more people are dying of drug overdoses annually than died during the entire Vietnam War. People need to be needed, but McKinsey and Company estimates that globally, 50% of paid activities, aka jobs, could be automated by currently demonstrated technologies. America's single largest job category is driver. And so, with self-driving vehicles here and now, up to 2/3 of those particular jobs could disappear within the coming decade or decade and a half. High turnover, or the big quit or the great resignation, resulted in 1 in 5, or 47 million Americans quitting their jobs in 2021 alone. Millions of baby boomers retiring early, millions of Gen Z workers, teenagers up to early 20s, quitting whatever job they just begun at the time. 1 in every 7 blue-collar employees saying, "Take this job and shove it." 1 in 4 of every white-collar folks following suit, and an unprecedented number of women exiting the workplace. And when at work, whether that's a physical space or a mental place, we find ourselves increasingly chained to screens, yet feeling less connected, more unmoored, and increasingly distracted. Less connected because, in so many ways, nothing has, is, or ever will replace face-to-face relationship building. Yet 54% of Americans are currently working hybrid. 63% of U.S. companies say they're heading toward hybrid as their full-time arrangement. And depending on what you read, 87 to 93% of American workers say they'd like to work from home at least 1 to 2 days a week. The only exception being Gen Z workers, as 74% of them want more face-to-face interaction, not less. And that's because they are painfully aware how much they are missing out on all that nuance and mentorship that is so essential to developing vocational mastery. And between disconnection and distraction, there's disengagement. Gallup research published earlier this month reveals that 70% of U.S. employees consider themselves disengaged at work. And research from the University of California indicates that motivated employees are 31% more productive and 3 times more creative than demotivated employees. According to a Corporate Leadership Council study involving 50,000 participants, motivated employees are also 87% less likely to quit. Moreover, for good or bad, Gallup research continues to show what has been true forever, that an employee's motivation is immensely influenced by his or her manager, the exact number being at or around 70% of an employee's motivation, which means that most employees don't quit jobs, they quit their bosses. Regarding distraction, just look at focus and flow. Focus is selectively concentrating on one aspect of the environment without distraction by other things. And flow is the mental state of operation in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in an activity, a feeling of energized focus, a full involvement of enjoyment. Or, said more simply, is complete absorption in what one is doing. But look at what we've done to each other. Plopped everyone and all our employees down in front of computer screens, where minutes are kept, hours are lost, and interruptions, by way of alerts, notifications, reminders, meeting requests, and the like, are never ending, having become the air we breathe or the water in which we swim all day, every day, day after day. The loss of momentum is deleterious because so much interruption and distraction leg sweeps both focus and flow. Attentiveness, concentration, getting in the zone, being on a roll, going beast mode, or just plain old being present with others is virtually impossible when our computers chime and phones ring with ceaseless invitations to interact. Our mental energies drain to empty, as ping by ping we forfeit any measure whatsoever of sustained productivity and deep meaning. Economically speaking, our pandemic contributed to incredible volatility, a decline in employment and income for a super long stretch, a stretch which for many continues to this day, and from which some may never recover. This economic insecurity not only creates the obvious adverse impact on one's mental health, but also supercharges the side hustle economy. Side Hustle Nation reports that 45% of working Americans now have a side hustle. That's a whopping 70 million people. Among millennials, that statistic rises to 50%, and a gobsmacking 70% of Gen Z reports they already have or are currently looking for a side hustle. This distractedness translates quantifiably because the average side hustler spends 11 to 16 hours a week on these other businesses. Let that sink in. That's a full or additional 1 to 2 more days of work every week of not just mental distraction, but even divided emotional allegiance to one's employer. Here's what's interesting to me. It's not that hustlers are cheaters and thieves constantly prowling for outs, so much as friends, neighbors, great employees trying to make ends meet economically. Because according to Bankrate, 41% of side hustlers need the money to pay for room, board, and other essential expenses. In 2022, 29% of side hustles were begun in response to inflationary spikes and what it costs to put gas in the car and food on the table. Bringing the conversation full circle, it is true that only half of side hustlers love their primary job, while 76% love their side hustle. Though it's unclear which comes first, which is the chicken, and which is the egg. Specifically, do disconnection, distraction, disengagement, and economic disruption give birth to the side hustle? Or does the focus, purpose, and profit flowing from side hustles prompt vocational disillusionment with one's primary employer? That will be clear in the short term, I believe, not the long term, though my gut already has the answer. Nothing trumps calling, control, and the creativity that blossoms when people put their heads down to try and succeed at something of their own making, especially if calling our own shots translates to economic security and just might lead to greater joy and personal and professional fulfillment. In our schools, between cyberbullying, harassment, body shaming, the digital divide, and cultural and parental politics besotting what's taught in our children's classrooms, and why, and how, and to what end, there's no shortage of reasons to be discouraged. Beyond so many social emotional issues, our nation's report card, published by the National Center for Education Statistics, a branch of the Education Department, confirms what many of us feared any night we might have watched the news these past 3 years. That the pandemic had a profound impact on K-12 academics, particularly in math and reading, with national averages down 3 and 8 points respectively. These scores represent the most significant decline since assessing began in the early 1990s. There is a silver lining here, albeit a reactive rather than proactive one. The American Rescue Plan provides $122 billion targeted specifically to address education challenges resulting from the pandemic. Most of that money prioritizes the hiring of personnel to combat the shortage of teachers across the country, followed by the tackling of learning loss to be remediated through tutoring programs, new class materials, and summer schools. But while retaking the educational hill we got to climb in this country, we also have to keep in mind that 1 in 4 children between the ages of 13 and 18 are burdened with anxiety disorders. Culturally, societally, and more locally in our own communities, it is both literally and figuratively a war out there. 2020 was the most violent year since the Gun Violence Archive began tracking gun deaths in 2013. According to the organization, 611 mass shootings occurred in 2020, exceeding any other recent year by more than 50%. And the number of overall gun homicides is at its highest rate in more than 20 years. But there's a quieter killer out there, an insidious one, something that's every bit as dangerous and which kills far more Americans than guns, and that's loneliness. Though awash in news channels and Facebook friends, we are unhappier, feel more isolated, and are less fulfilled than the number of one's followers might lead us to believe. Loneliness, not obesity, cancer, or heart disease, is the nation's #1 health crisis. Persistent loneliness reduces average longevity more than twice as much as heavy drinking and more than 3 times as much as obesity, which is often a consequence of loneliness. Research demonstrates that loneliness is as physically dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and contributes to cognitive decline, including more rapid advance of Alzheimer's. In his book, The Vanishing American Adult by Ben Sasse, he writes that in decades past, quote, Americans stocked their imaginations with the same things. In the 1950s, 70% of televisions tuned into I Love Lucy. But today, when 93% of Americans have access to more than 500 channels, the most watched cable news program garners a meager 1% of the United States population's eyeballs. End quote. In the last 25 years, the average number of times Americans entertained others in their homes declined nearly 50%. Despite being figuratively hyperconnected across social media platforms, we are literally disconnected, with fewer non-virtual friends than at any point in decades. A recent Pew survey indicates that Americans check their smartphone screens every 4.3 minutes, and nearly 40% of those ages 18 through 29 are online almost every waking minute. If that fact doesn't give us pause, I don't know what will. It would seem that boredom, which is natural, essential, and healthy, has been swapped for shallow distractions, which are not. In his book, Irresistible, The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked, Dr. Adam Alter reminds us that when we spend a lot of time on our screens and social media, our threshold for boredom declines dramatically. And it's important to be bored occasionally because boredom pushes us to think differently, divergently, and far more creatively. Throughout history, many great minds, including Einstein, have praised the powers of daydreaming and boredom. This time spent in the subconscious is where we give our brains time to process all the information we've had coming in. This is why many people have some of their best ideas in the shower. He suggests that next time we feel boredom creeping in or our mind starting to wander, we should let it, rather than giving in to the knee-jerk reaction to check Twitter or TikTok for the 10th time in an hour. Speaking of social media, programmers as peddlers have gotten us addicted to distraction, but we're parched for genuine community. I've got a dozen major concerns about social media, but here are 4 of them. First is feelings of inadequacy and decreased self-esteem that arise from such heightened and unrealistic comparison. Social media intentionally shows us the best sides of those we follow, the sides they want us to see. Any significant time lost comparing our real selves to others' perfectly presented selves is a recipe for disaster. Scrolling impulsively through the rich, famous, and supermodel sort while eating junk food or starving ourselves to death is a direct path to discouragement and devastatingly low self-esteem. Second is the fact that people are more than their profiles. The more time young people in particular, though it's true for all of us, spend time immersed in these online fictions and fabrications, the duller our empathy and the number we become to social sensitivities and real-life social cues. I'm specifically thinking about the comments section, what people write online that they would never or should never say in real life, but also about all the cliques and clans and partisan politics and tribal warfare and hate-mongering and threatening that arises online, and the extremism and lone wolves these sorts of interactions produce. Another terrible consequence of addiction, social media sort, is physical, but also more than that. A great deal of human happiness derives from movement and connection to nature. So inactivity indoors for hours, days, or weeks on end can leave us feeling physically unfitter, mentally duller, emotionally stunted, and socially awkward. More great reasons to feel bad about ourselves. Fourth and finally, for now at least, I worry about our kids growing up in a world in which entertainment is mistaken for objective journalism. A world in which everything is a show. I find that in some cases, this exacerbates the already problematic egocentric WIFM question, or WIIFM, the radio station we all tune into. What's in it for me? Because we are not the center of the universe, and thinking that we are is unhealthy and an altogether unreal point of view through which selflessness, acts of kindness, altruism, and giving in general might happen less frequently and in smaller amounts. Which brings me to the pandemic and the increasingly evident consequences of it. I've already touched on mental health, economic insecurity, and gun violence. But we can't forget aggressive and violent incidents on airplanes. Some 2,500 in 2021 alone, a 20-fold increase, according to the FAA. And in the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey of 2021, anxiety rates jumped from 6.9% in 2019, before the pandemic, to 37.3% at the height of it. A 6-fold increase like that in just 2 short years is unprecedented. Moderate to severe depression among adults jumped from 7% to 30.2% during the pandemic, and 43.5% of young adults reported moderate to severe anxiety. 13% of American adults reported having started or increased substance use during the pandemic. 26% reported stress-related symptoms, and 11% reported having serious thoughts of suicidal ideation in the preceding 30 days. These numbers are nearly double pre-pandemic rates. As in prior studies, the Household Pulse Survey also showed that food insufficiency, financial concerns, and loneliness were 3 risk factors frequently predicting anxiety symptoms or suicidal ideation. This echoes what I believe is an important truth and one that I share with HR professionals nearly everywhere I go. Powerlessness frequently leads to overreactions, be they silence, violence, or self-harm. So involve employees and emphasize their personal agency in everything you do, especially organizational changes. Philosophically and then politically, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson suggested that we may pursue happiness, though nothing of the sort is promised. The World Happiness Report has made that pretty clear, as an increasing number of lives are characterized by stress, worry, sadness, and depression, rather than optimism, much less joy. I do hope no one is looking to politicians to increase human satisfaction or to decrease any of these misery metrics, because these are not remotely in their job descriptions any more than morality exists in their legislation. Politicians appeal to pleasure and pain and keep us distracted by emotional appeals to our gator brains rather than higher order cerebral thinking, as evidenced by debate victors being judged not by their policies or legislative performance, but rather by their presentative popularity, much like juries are excessively swayed by lawyer likability rather than the preponderance of evidence. When I interviewed Gary Moreau in 2017 for Fireside, he remarked that today's political process is incapable of offering us a humble leader. No side is willing to concede or to compromise, and the gladiators put forth from every party are, by definition, locked into an agenda within a zero-sum game designed to perpetuate itself rather than to evolve. I feel the exact same way. And so what should be civil discourse in the proverbial public square becomes combat, chanting, echo chambers, internecine conflicts, and vapid sound bites. Here's a case in point. Because this month was the midterms, I saw political messaging everywhere I went that was no more nuanced than this. The radical so-and-sos and dumbass who's-its are destroying our nation. Together, we can make or keep this place the best last hope for freedom and liberty in the known free world. Take a stand today and vote, 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 fight, fight, fight with me today. Yeah. That's super nuanced and constructive. Exacerbating these shortcomings and perhaps as our punishment, getting the leaders we deserve. There are, ironically, very few regulating or governing forces in media, the rubber tubes through which we get our fix. The fact checkers, for example, tell us what we need to know, but not what we want to hear. And so, rather than paying heed to what they find, we listen instead for dog whistles and come running to watch the latest political train wreck or car accident. Rubbernecking, but rarely rising above the din of anger or fear, because these, like blood on the highway or sex, sell way more stories. I wish there was some way to turn the tide, but doing so is tantamount to changing human nature. There are half a dozen hormones that surge through our bodies when we are distressed. So shy of self-medicating all day, every day, to tame our brain and adrenal glands, we have to simply learn to cope with cortisol, norepinephrine, adrenaline, and the like each and every time we ingest whatever drama is being pushed publicly by the body politic. Campaign after campaign, cycle after cycle, it's fight, flight, and freeze across every single network. A convening of the predictable, same old bobbleheads. We compensate richly to do nothing more than tell us what we want to hear, thereby reinforcing and amplifying our biases and closed-mindedness. Anytime I realize I'm deriving joy from following a news story that sensationalizes someone's hurt, or that preys on an enemy's failing or losing, I feel ashamed. But apparently not so much that the following night I'll modify my behavior. Apparently, what matters most is my base instinct answer in the affirmative to Maximus's really fundamental question. Are you not entertained? Want to see the story played, replayed, hashed, rehashed, and enlarged ad infinitum? Then please join us every hour on the hour for the next 2 weeks, where we'll be retelling the same sad thing until something even more dastardly drops in our laps to replace it. For whatever it's worth, I do believe we consistently vote our consciences, though doing so often involves pinching our noses and choosing the lesser of two evils, which hardly feels all that inspirational or aspirational in what remains, so we're told, the greatest country in the world, even if 70 million of us think that it's not that great anymore, or that if only we're willing to go backward, we just might make it to the future. Spiritually speaking, we are understandably dispirited by all of this. Americans continue to rate moral values negatively, some 47% describing them now as poor, Gallup tells us. A Barna Group study, one that included all adult age groups, ethnicities, genders, socioeconomic statuses, and political ideologies, indicates that 80% of Americans have concerns about our nation's moral condition. Respondents cited citizens' anything-goes attitude, the blurring and graying of the line between right and wrong, the perception that morality is dispensable, that greed is good, that God is dead, that self-indulgence is on the rise, and that moral ambiguity and dysfunction having become the order of the day are the reasons why. Yep, all told, our nation's in a tricky spot. We are divided, disconnected, and adrift. Our leaders win by any means necessary. Our employees feel disposable and disinterested. Our educators are overwhelmed and ill-equipped. Our children are shooting and killing each other with high-caliber semi-automatic rifles. And apparently the only thing unifying us more than our grief is our hatred of those who stand in our way. Thank God our story doesn't end there. I look forward to seeing the world a bit rosier through the optimistic eyes of Gary Moreau, Randy Pausch, and John Krasinski next time. Join me then as we stroll to the sunnier side of the street in the Gratitude Series, Episode 3.